My name is Amy Montour, and I'm a physician with the Department of Family Medicine here at McMaster. And I am a Haudenosaunee woman, Oneida Nation from the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. I've been working with the Department of Family Medicine for a few years, first of all, to develop faculty education around Indigenous health, to give the background of the Indigenous peoples in Canada and how it impacts their health today. I've recently taken on the role of the site director at the Grand River Six Nations Residency Campus in Brantford, and our focus there will really be to develop further training opportunities for family medicine residents who want to learn more about Indigenous health.
In family medicine, we often think of surgery in one way, and I am so pleased that this surgical team is so progressive in what they're doing. So thank you for asking me to come. So if you'll notice in the background, I have a bear there, and the reason why is in my culture, animals, everything in nature has a meaning, and the bear is the keeper of the medicine. And so when I think about medicine and what I do when I talk about culture and how to be culturally sensitive, I always think that I'm in some way doing the job that I was meant to do. I just became a full-time professor, so previous to that I did a lot of paid consult work around Indigenous health. And I want to congratulate you all for coming here today because this is an actual tangible response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what is happening today. Because you've said, okay, let's come together, let's listen, and let's learn about the truth. And I think that's the approach that we all need to take. It's not an us against them type of approach in Canada. We need to walk alongside each other as Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. So we're going to take Canada as our case study in global health today. All of these headlines here are from 2019. When we think about missing and murdered Indigenous women, you know, a lot of the media got caught up on the word genocide. But the fact that there are missing and murdered Indigenous women is what we should be caught up on. The fact that our remote communities do not have access to the same things that we have here in Southern Ontario. When Dr. Foster was speaking about technology, I was asked to go up to Saskatchewan, which is on the west coast of the James Bay, about 2 years ago, to look and see if we could use technology in some of these remote communities. There's no fiber optic cable. There's no way to get the internet there. And even if we did, we're talking about a community that only speaks the Cree language. So if one of us docs from Hamilton were speaking English up there, we would still have to go through a second party to even speak to the patient. Grassy Narrows is a community in Northern Ontario that has had mercury poisoning from an industry for 40 years. Every successive government in the last 40 years has known that this community is dealing with mercury in their water, and yet we still have not had a solution. And then our child welfare system. Most of us have heard about the residential school system in Canada, but what we haven't heard is that although Canadian children make up only 4% of Canada's population, they make up 50% of the population in child welfare systems today. So we are dealing with a situation in which populations within Canada are living in second and third world conditions. And that's how it relates to global health. And all of that is known to Indigenous people, maybe not the details, but certainly the stories are, and it breeds mistrust of the healthcare system. Brian Sinclair is a gentleman who lived in Manitoba, and in 2008, he went to his community health clinic because he was having a health issue. He was an amputee, he was in a wheelchair. And when he seen the doctor at the clinic, they thought maybe he had a urinary tract infection and something was wrong with his chronic catheter. So they tucked a little note in his pocket and they sent him off to the ER and said, you need to go to the ER to be assessed. He went into the ER, and the 34 hours that he spent in the ER were all captured on videotape. He went to the triage nurse and told him why he was there. And then he waited for 34 hours. And in those 34 hours, he became sicker and sicker and sicker. Other patients around him went up to the healthcare staff and said, I think there's something wrong with this man, but nobody come and checked on him. When he began vomiting, somebody handed him a pail, but still he did not receive any health care. When the nurse finally went over to see what was going on 34 hours later, he was in full rigor. He had died from sepsis, from a treatable UTI in a Canadian emergency room. So where did the disease start? People often ask me, I just finished being the cancer lead for our region for Indigenous people, and I was constantly being asked, why do your people show up late for a diagnosis? They're always in stage 4 and then we can't do anything. Why don't they get their cancer screening done? Why are they sort of wallowing in diabetes and obesity and heart disease? Well, the disease actually started several years ago. And I don't want this to be a moment of blame or shame or guilt, because it's not. None of us here today made those policies and the legislation that led to the disease. But it is a legacy of Canada that most Canadians don't know. Colonialism put into place the Indian Act. The Indian Act was in 1876. It is still in place today. Today, under the federal government, I am not seen as an Indigenous person. I am an Indian. And I didn't even realize how crazy that was until I came to McMaster. I was about 28 years old, and I grew up calling myself an Indian. So I was in a small group learning situation, and I was talking about myself, and I said the word Indian. And there was one of my classmates who truly was from India. And she said to me, "You're not Indian." And I thought, maybe I'm not Indian, which was the impetus for me to start studying my own history. The Indian Act also put into place the reserve system. Previous to that, Indigenous people, they were migratory people. They had a base where they lived. So my people were in the Finger Lakes region of the New York state. But we came to this region because the Indigenous people in this area knew that this region was bountiful, it was fruitful, and we all shared it together. But the reserve system changed all of that. We were then put into boundaried areas. And you may say, well, what does that have to do with today? I was talking to a healthcare leader in Thunder Bay, and she was talking about the challenges of bringing people down from the north to Thunder Bay to receive tertiary care services. And she could not understand how the Indian Act had anything to do with that. And I said, do you really think that those people chose to live in communities that had no infrastructure, that had no access other than air or water? That was the reserve system under the Indian Act that caused that. And the whole idea of the Indian Act was that Indigenous people were the other, that they had nothing to offer to Canada, that we needed to be assimilated into Canadian civilization. Over time, and over the last 150 years, the Indian Act has been amended greatly. There was a time when my people could not go to university, could not fight in the war, could not do anything that other Canadians did unless we decided that we would renounce who we were as Indigenous people. So in 1978, when I was 3 years old, there were only 2,600 Indigenous students all across Canada. That's why there is not as many Indigenous physicians, because we're still playing catch up. But anytime that you introduce policy and legislation that makes somebody the other, you also introduce racism and social exclusion. And so that becomes entrenched in everything that happens after that, all of the policy and the legislation that comes down. And when you make somebody the other, you impact their self-esteem. And the thing that colonialism did overall was to take away our self-determination, the right to say who we are and who we are going to be. Now, I put this quote up here because in the news we hear all the time these controversies around statues of historical figures. And I'm not here today to point a finger at Sir John A. Macdonald. But this quote is an example of how Indigenous people experienced Canada and their policies and their politicians very differently than Canada did. And this is what he said: "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strong pressed on myself as the head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes and thoughts of white men." And that was the basis for residential schools. It wasn't to teach us to be doctors and lawyers. It was to teach us to be somebody different than who we were. What some people don't realize is that this was like a virus. Our Canadian politicians learned about central industrial schools from the US, who first instituted them. And then once we had ours in place, South Africa came here and learned about our residential schools and took that back there as well. So when you have a worldview that sees people this way, it's easy to see how policy and legislation follows that worldview. And that brings us to the systemic effects of the disease. And that's in our systems. And it's in our systems today, our healthcare systems, our education systems, our infrastructure in our communities, how we view the environment, and again, down to self-determination. Now, I put this picture of a status card on here because most people have not seen a status card. The federal government decides who is a status Indian still today, and if they decide you are a status Indian, you get this card. And with it, yes, you do get some benefits. I have a drug benefit that is similar to ODB. I have tuition paid, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about that tuition paid piece. I was a high school dropout. I dropped out in the middle of grade 10. I didn't grow up believing that I could be anything. I didn't think I was going to be anything. I just went to school because I was told to go to school. I remember coming out of a high school hockey tournament, and my brother had played for the high school we were going to, which was off reserve. And he was a good hockey player. And he was walking out of the arena, and his own classmates spit on him and called him a wagon burner. It was that kind of environment that I was a teenager in, and it made me angry, and it made me want to lash out, and it made me angry at everybody, and that's why I quit high school. I found myself a teen mom at 16 in a very difficult marriage at 17 that ended in domestic violence. And over the next 8 years, I didn't know what I was going to do with myself. I ended up remarrying, having a couple more children, but still, I never thought I was smart. I believed that I was somehow less than. And then at 25, I found myself in an incredible amount of debt from a broken marriage, with 3 children and no education and no work experience. And I thought, this isn't good enough, and this isn't the way I want my children to grow up. So I went to a small community polytech in my community, and they helped me to get my GED. When I got the results back of that, it was reported in percentiles. I didn't even understand what percentiles were. So I took it over to the school and I said, what does this mean? And they said, this means you did really well, and we're not going to let you stop here. So they handed me a big book of careers, and they said, pick something. So I took it home over the weekend, and I had no idea what I wanted to be. But when I looked through the career book, I realized that nursing was a good career with good job prospects, and I could make a good wage, and I'd be out in 4 years. So that meant that my children and I would have a better life. That year, my children and I lived on $17,000, and we lived on 6 nations. Thank goodness I lived there, because I lived in my own community with my own family, and they helped me get through that year. But then I entered the educational process. I came to McMaster for a Bachelor's of Science in Nursing. Halfway through that, I met Andrea Bowman from the Global Health Office, and I worked as her research assistant for a year. And she said, you know what? If you want to do your master's degree, I'll pay you to come here and do it. I said, okay, let's do it. So I worked part-time as an RN, and I did my master's degree. Halfway through my master's degree, Claudia Faso, a nursing professor at McMaster, called me and said, you know, McMaster Medical School is looking for Indigenous applicants, and I think you'd be good at it. And I laughed, and I said, thank you, and I hung the phone up. And I thought, how could she say that? Like, I'm a high school dropout. I was a teen mom. Like, I'm not the person that becomes a doctor. And when I went and called my mother, like I do with all my big life decisions, she didn't laugh. She said, well, why not? And so I applied and I got in. And in my journey through healthcare, I realized that that's where I belonged, that it was a skill and a talent of mine, but I didn't know that when I was a little kid, because the system didn't foster that in me at all. Fast forward now to when I'm a family physician working in the system, and that's why I talk about this, because I see all of the places in the system that have left us behind, and I'm trying to work to push my people forward. But the system still works against me. So when I was in medical school, I was so happy when I walked into orientation day and there were banks sitting there, Because even though my tuition was paid, I still had 3 children to look after, and I didn't know how to do that. And the bank said, well, you're going to be a doctor. Here, have some money. Well, I lived on reserve, and we're not in the tax system. I didn't really understand all of the banking system. So I said, oh, thank you, and I signed on the dotted line. And that's how I survived medical school, was living on that student line of credit. When I got out, I didn't realize that the expectation was that I would convert that into a personal line of credit or into a loan. I couldn't do that. I today still cannot have a personal line of credit or a loan because I live on reserve and all of my assets are on federal land that cannot be repossessed by a bank. So I'm a doctor who cannot get credit. The system doesn't work for all of us. Many of us in Canada don't know that there was a whole separate Indian hospital system for us. That operated from 1920 to 1980s. And it wasn't to give us culturally competent care, it was to protect Canada from the Indian tuberculosis epidemic. What a lot of folks don't know is that tuberculosis did not exist in the Americas prior to contact with European nations. However, once the Indian Act imposed the reserve system and changed our way of living, it bred the social conditions that allowed tuberculosis to run rampant. And so these hospitals were built to protect the rest of Canada from us. In fact, in these hospitals, long after we knew that medications could cure TB and control the symptoms, people underwent lobectomies without anesthesia, without all the proper care, because nobody really cared what was happening in these Indian hospitals. There's a body of work by Maureen Lux out of Brock University where she's looked at these in depth. One of these Indian hospitals was on my community in Six Nations. There's a story of a young woman who came in who needed an appendectomy. Should have been a simple surgery. She was healthy. Should have been an easy surgery. They didn't have properly trained anesthesia there. So somebody who didn't have the skills and knowledge did it. And she never survived that surgery. In the report back to the ministry, the medical person at that time commented in the report that it was a good thing that nobody knew. That happened in residential schools as well. Both in Indian hospitals and residential schools, the subjects were research experiments. The military came into residential schools and they would split the students down the middle and they'd say half get rations, half don't, and we'll see if the ones on rations can survive, because if they can, then we know that our military men will be able to use these rations. With the beta HCG vaccine, that was tested on Indigenous children in Quebec without their consent and without their knowledge. So we have a legacy of all of these systems that have done things without our knowledge, without our consent, and without our input, and that has bred mistrust of the system. Which leads us to the proximal determinants of health, which are the symptoms of the disease. So we know about all of these things because we hear about them in the news all the time, that we have poor housing. In fact, the United Nations on Friday delivered another report to Canada that their housing conditions for Indigenous people were atrocious, and there must be something done about that. That was last Friday in Canada. It's not appropriate to say that, those people in the north, they don't have these things and it's too expensive. It's like Jagmeet Singh said in his campaign speech, if this was happening in Vancouver or in Toronto, would that be acceptable? It's not acceptable that this is happening in Canada. And employment and income, a lot of people live in poverty still. I know what it's like to live in poverty, and it's not easy. And you may think, well, why don't people just help themselves up? Well, it's for a lot of reasons, because they still see themselves as the other. They still see themselves as unable to obtain education. It still makes me giggle when people call me a doctor. And just this month I became a professor, a full-time professor, and I cannot wrap my head around that, because I didn't think that my people could do things like this. I didn't think so until I went to a course with a friend of mine before I started my educational journey, and I seen an Indigenous man at McMaster as the professor teaching a class. And I thought, what? We can do this? But there are still many of my people out there who don't believe they can do that. And when you live in a system that is sort of stacked against you, and you're living with these kinds of living conditions, you live in a state of chronic stress. And if you're in chronic stress, you're in chronic inflammation. And if you're in chronic inflammation, you are susceptible to chronic disease. I put this in here because it really drives that point home. I told you that there weren't very many people in post-secondary education. In fact, the first Indigenous physician was actually from Mississaugas of the Credit, 45 minutes down the road here. And the only reason he was the first Indigenous physician is he got into medical school in Canada just before the Indian Act Amendment said you couldn't go to university. The first nurse from my community, Edith Montour, she could not get trained in Canada. She had to go to the US in the military, and they trained her to be a nurse. And she is a famous woman now today, but she could not be trained in Canada. In my lifetime, I was 7 years old when Canada reopened their constitution, and that was when Aboriginal rights were reaffirmed and put into the constitution. I was 7 years old. Until that time, I was seen as a ward of the state. My parents were seen as ward of the state. And what that meant was Canada didn't believe that we had the mental capacity to make decisions for ourselves until 1982. And in fact, we could not make a human rights complaint. I myself, as an Indigenous person, could not make a human rights complaint in Canada until 2011. Section 67 of the Canadian Human Rights Act precluded that until 2008, and then there was a 3-year period where they had to implement it. So it's only been in the last 8 years that Indigenous people could make a human rights complaint. So people talk in the Indigenous world about transgenerational transmission of historical trauma. Even though the Western medical system may not be aware of the things that I've shown you today, the Indigenous people are. Maybe not in that level of detail, but the stories are passed down from person to person. I knew at 5 years old that there was an Indian Act and that it controlled everything about my life. I knew what it meant to live on a reserve. I knew what it meant to be socially excluded. There are still small restaurants in the area around where I live, 45 minutes from Hamilton, where it is extremely difficult for me to get served because of the color of my skin. This still happens today, every day, all the time. And so when you have the disease starting hundreds of years ago in policy and legislation, it affects a nation. And when you change how a nation sees themselves and how they govern themselves, you affect the community. And when you affect the community, you of course affect the family. And then you add in their residential schools who purposely broke apart families. And we say today, why are children in the welfare system? Well, these children were taken away from their families and they were put into a very institutional style setting. Nobody loved them. Nobody kissed them goodnight. Nobody tucked them in at night. There's a story at the residential school in Brantford about how there was a hot water pipe under the ceiling. And when the little boys, 4, 5, and 6, would cry and be sad, or they were sick and they missed their mother, the big boys would put them on top of the lockers underneath that pipe, and they would tell them to close their eyes and hold the pipe, because the pipe was warm, and pretend it's your mom. And that was the comfort that they got. So if you don't grow up learning how to love, and you don't grow up learning how to be a good parent, how do you then become a good parent? So there's a whole generation that lost their parenting skills as well. And when you don't know how to love and you don't know how to parent, you affect the individual. And then when you affect the individual, you change how they react and how they deal with stress. And you end up with sick people. So to bring it into a more Western framework, I like to use Maslow's hierarchy of needs because it's a very simple framework that all of us can understand, that we need these basic things to be the best that we can be. But how do the Indigenous social determinants of health factor into that? Well, if we want people to be resilient, if we want them to do cancer screening and to not smoke and to eat properly, then we have to address the issues that are important to them. It includes everything on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But here we can see where the distal determinants of health, where the policies and the legislations took away the esteem and the feeling of belonging for Indigenous people in Canada. And then you have systems that have entrenched racism within the system, and that makes people feel unsafe everywhere they go. And so they don't ask questions, and they don't ask for more. I'll give you an example. This was just a couple of months ago. I was told this story by a worker within our tertiary care system here of an Indigenous person who had to go into hospital. And while they were there, they were under surgical care. And in the morning, because I know surgeons round early, the surgeon would come in and wake this patient up. And I don't believe that the surgeon had any malintent, but the surgeon would kick the bed a little bit to wake the patient up. Well, what the surgeon didn't know was that that is how that person was woken up in residential school. So every morning, relive their experience in residential school just from that one activity. And then we know that we have to deal with the water. We have to deal with access to health. And we have to be able to offer Indigenous people the same level of care that we offer people in Toronto, people in Vancouver, people in Edmonton. And then when we can do all of that, then we're going to see the things that will help people to rise out of chronic disease, rise out of poverty, rise out of hopelessness. And it's something we need to do together. As Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, we have to do it together. We need to stop thinking of the poor sick Indian and what we can fix. But we need to start thinking about, well, how come they're still here? If all of that happened, why are they still here? There are strengths and there are resiliencies to be built upon. As I said, I wouldn't be here, I wouldn't be a doctor today if I didn't have parents and family members in a community that brought me food when I didn't have food, that looked after my kids when I couldn't afford for childcare and I needed to go to school. So let's start building on those strengths and the resiliency that are in these communities. There is a lot of wisdom there. There are relationships. There are great things about these communities. Let's stop thinking about them as just the poor, sick Indians. And this is how we do it. This is a living agreement between my people, the Haudenosaunee, and the Dutch. That's where it originally started in the 1600s, but it has come to encompass everyone, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And we didn't have a written language, so we had wampum. And our treaties, all of our agreements were recorded in wampum. And this is a story, actually. This wampum represents a river. And the white beads there represent the waters through which we will travel together. And that is peace, respect, and friendship. So very simple concepts that we learned when we were children. One of the purple bars is a European ship with everything that is good about European cultures and cultures from everywhere. Your knowledge, your wisdom, your skills, your medicine, everything is in your ship. And in the other purple bar is a canoe. And in that is the Indigenous people and everything that is good about those Indigenous people. And we're going to reset the relationship. We're going to travel down this river of life together because we have common goals. Everyone wants to be happy and healthy. So those are our common goals. And we're not going to jump in each other's ship and take over, but we'll reach out and help when we need to. And if we remember peace, respect, and friendship, then we can keep coming back to a relationship that will help us move forward. And I like this. This is out of a study done by the British folks with GPs, and they looked at how do you become culturally competent and how do you affect change by becoming cultural competence. And it's more than just knowledge. Yes, we need to know about the cultures that we're working with, how they view the world, but then we have to self-reflect. Who are we? What do we believe? What are our own stereotypes and biases? And I'm going to give you an example of myself. So recently, Caledonia is a small non-Indigenous town right beside Six Nations, and it has a land claim on it. So there was a piece of land that was leased to Caledonia or Haldimand County that was never given back, and that land claim remains in the court system today. But we coexist together anyways. However, I was recently told by a friend of mine in Caledonia that there were Syrian refugees settled in that community. And my first response was anger. What do you mean? What do you mean somebody from another country came here again and took our land? That was my first response. And then I had to check myself because that wasn't appropriate. That wasn't in the spirit of peace, respect, and friendship. So I had to learn about the Syrian situation. I had to understand why Syrian people needed to come here and why they needed to live in Caledonia. And when I checked myself, I understood better, and that anger was gone. And then I had the privilege of working with a Syrian family as one of their family members came to the end of life. And I learned so much from that, and I was so honored and blessed to be a part of their experience. And it's when we can take our knowledge, examine our attitudes, and then put that into a skill that we can change systems and we can change the way things are done. So we're in McMaster, and we are the home of evidence-based medicine, are we not? Well, I'm here to tell you today that we don't have good evidence base for Indigenous health in Canada. Much of it is outdated or inaccurate. And you have to think about the wide geographic variation. On Six Nations here, I have access to the greatest tertiary care system that I know about right here at McMaster. I can just drive down the road and access that. But think about those folks that are way in the north. They don't have access to that. They have to travel several days often to come here. And when they come here, who supports them? The people in the north often speak their native tongue. So they come here and they don't speak English. They don't know what we're saying to them. Are we truly getting informed consent when we don't have interpreters for these people? And then low participation rate. Because of that legacy of research that happened in residential schools and Indian hospitals, our people are fearful of participating in research. We're afraid of what might happen to us. And we're afraid that all of that knowledge comes and is taken from us, and it's used to build careers and to build systems, but never used to come back and help the situation that we live in. And results are not comparable across studies. Indigenous people are a really heterogeneous group. If you are a person that has status, you have access to things like a small drug benefit. But there are First Nations people without status, and they don't have access to that. If you live on reserve, you have the benefit of family and community right there. If you live in town, you may not. And so if you're poor and you don't know where to access things, you may really suffer. And in fact, 50% of First Nations people now live in urban centers. So it's a whole different experience whether you grew up on reserve or off reserve. And then the Métis and the Inuit, they have a completely different relationship with Canada than the First Nations people do. And how they experience the world and what they have access to and what their benefits are completely different than mine. So you can't do a study that says all Indigenous people in Canada. It would never work. And then most research studies have been inconsistent with Indigenous worldviews. It's been that idea of going in and studying people like subjects instead of co-designing studies where it benefits the community and the Western researcher. And that's where we need to go today, is to those co-design, right from the beginning, right from when we're developing that research question. It needs to be done together. Find an Indigenous partner. And then we need to think about trauma-informed practice. And this applies to anywhere we go where people have suffered any type of trauma. We need to know what that trauma was. And today you've learned a little bit about the trauma of Indigenous people. And then when somebody like Brian Sinclair comes into the ER or comes to access care, instead of thinking, oh, there's another drunk Indian, he's probably just coming in to sleep it off, we're going to think about them very differently. We're going to think about why they're there. Even if they're angry, even if they're not acting in the way we think that somebody should be acting, we need to be asking ourselves why. Why is that happening? And how can I change or adapt to make them more comfortable here so that they feel safer, so that they feel like they can access care? And this is from my patients. I always ask my patients, I always ask them and their family, is there anything else I can do? Is there anything else you want me to know? Because I'm always continually collecting that. And they tell me that doctors talk too much. You come in the room and you're blah, 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 and then you're gone. And you didn't stop and listen to what I was saying to you. And they said, we're too serious. Laugh. Share a little piece of yourself. Share a little human piece of yourself. And, I do palliative care, and that doesn't seem like there should be humor involved in it. But I use humor. It's medicine. It is medicine. And if I do a palliative care consult where I haven't been able to get a little laugh out of somebody, I feel like I failed. And we have to realize that even though people are sick and living with chronic diseases, there's quality of life in that. There's still some benefit to what they're doing. They feel quality in their life. And we as the healthcare providers, we get busy and we get overtaxed with all the things that people want us to do. But in fact, when you were in medical school, you probably had an experience that made you realize what an honor it was to be able to be in that person's life at that moment. We need to go back to that feeling where we realized it was an honor to be a medical professional, to be in healthcare, because we get to witness things that nobody else gets to witness. We get to see things that nobody else gets to see. It's an honor. And then we need to allow people to live until they die. And this comes to me from my palliative care lens, because oftentimes people come to me and they'll say, well, the doctor told me I only have 6 months to live. And then it's like everybody descends on them. Okay, you need a will. Okay, you need this. Okay, this. No, we're going to plan for your death. Well, yes, we need to do all those things, but they're still living. Let's let them live too. Let's let them have some joy and hope too. And then use our influence. I appreciate what Carlos said this morning about needing the tall white man to come and say it in the community. That happens to me all the time. My community sent me to get educated, and still I need the tall white man to come back with me and tell them that this is actually the truth. So we need to start using our influence where we can. As in Western trained physicians, we are seen as experts around the world, everywhere, and in Indigenous communities. So use your voice when you can. If you see a system or an organization that is putting up barriers, separating communities, separating families, that is putting in place paternalistic type of care, then say it. Because if you say it, they'll listen. They'll listen. So I just want to leave you out with this. This is a quote by a chief from my community. He's gone on now. But silver was also something we used to represent relationship with our European brothers. And the reason why silver was chosen was my people they made the wampum, and then they said, well, we need something that represents European values. So they looked at their ships and they seen these large anchors, and they at that time, for some reason, they were made out of silver. And the people said to them, do you find that is a good metal? Like, is that strong? And they said, yes, it is. It's very strong. The only problem is it tarnishes. So we made a second agreement with them called the Covenant Chain, and it's all based on silver. And it says that we'll pay attention to the relationship, because just like silver, this is going to be a strong relationship and we're going to be together. But just like silver, it will tarnish. And so we have to pay attention to it. We have to stop and think about what we're doing and polish that silver from time to time so that the relationship stays strong. Thank you.
I'm very proud of McMaster. In the last few years, I've seen this resurgence of interest in Indigenous health and Indigenous people within Canada. And I would encourage everyone to continue to be curious, to look for ways to build their own understanding of Indigenous people. Because once we understand how to best work with Indigenous people in Canada, those principles can be translated to all other cultures as well.